We understand that we have historical examples when thinking about the war could lead to some kind of social shifts. Here's to me. Yes, I am interested in an example. For example, here is the revival of the theory of just war during the Vietnam War. In the United States, where university people in general turned out that they are in demand from the military, who are tired of waging such a war and by such means. This is a very good example. But there, well, at the same time, a big mistake was made again. Well, in history, sometimes cases don't work in a good area. It was then that mass was invented. But in fact, it was then that television became mass. The mediatization of the war took place for the first time. And for one group of scientists, this is how conditionally you have brought in the theory of modern warfare. It became a lesson, and they tried to draw from it, in my opinion, a healthier conclusion. But, unfortunately, conditionally, what I call the black logo, understood, a dot, so it can be manipulated even better. What will Baudrillard write about in 20 years? That there was no Gulf War. In other words, you see, no one has cancelled free will, no one has cancelled human choice, including human choice. Well, people, science is a big word. Well, people of meanings, let's call it that. And this is to the question of personal responsibility. It's very important to understand who you work for. In this regard, in my opinion, one of these very simple appeals that you can definitely take on yourself and convey is, well, don't work for emotional sublimation. Regardless of what you believe in now, regardless of which side you are fighting on, but it does not work for emotional sublimation either. In other words, emotional sublimation, in my opinion, and you yourself, let's say, is so uncontrollable, I repeat, with a virus that you cannot control. That is, it is not necessary to feed him. That is, well, this is my attitude, if you will, to what is happening. In other words, here, I even speak, let's say, I express my personal position. I'm sorry. In other words, this is my approach in general. In other words, ethical is normal. It's okay if you want to talk about that meta, about what you stand for, about the values you are fighting for, if you sincerely believe in them, through your texts and speeches there. I don't see any contradiction here. But if you just sublime it, conditionally hype, emotion, panic, there I do not know, paranoia and so on. This is you just pouring oil on this fire. That is, yes, in my opinion, this is a very strong position, but here the question arises of such a reflexive. And how can you diagnose yourself? Are you in emotions or in a trance? Isn't it because it's that emotion? It's always so binary, and this is with non-binary. Well, experience. I mean, unfortunately, I can't give a simple answer, but it's kind of general. Therefore, here it is we who even go beyond the war. What is the main one? It seems to me that the main challenge for the 21st century is precisely the challenge of awareness. We see this in family relations, demographic relations, and economic relations. Why shouldn't it be in media consumption and in media reality? In other words, this is a problem of awareness, a problem of self-reflection. In a sense, the problem of the return of monastic practice. That is, the ability to trace why you feel what you feel at this moment. And is this feeling your feeling? Or this feeling, because you were pressed on the nerve ending there, I do not know, through the picture. And now you consider it your duty to share this particular emotion. That is, it is an experience. This is such a self-learning process if. But then, if I can, maybe it's not wrong, I'll try to share it. I'm just thinking about it now. And it's this thesis about the tool of such reflection. The fact is that in emotional sublimation, it is Manichaean in nature, in the nature of emotions. While ethical, it has depth, it has depth, it is not reducible to the fact that our good enemies are bad. Because inside, there is a depth of ours, there is a depth of love for our own. It is also a love that has no border. And where there is a border, there is an ethical one. Well, relatively speaking, yes, I will add, that is, relatively speaking, the test for an ethical sense can be like this. The fact that, even when fighting the enemy, you love him, that is, relatively speaking. If this, well, it doesn't matter at what level, that is, the enemy, that is, in this sense, enemies can also be loved, that is, not to see them as a binary fiend of evil. Well, yes, this is a good principle, that is, enemies can also be loved. This is a paradox. In other words, this does not mean that you will not have a warrior, because the reality is tragic, the story is tragic, and they will, but it is quite possible that you will have wars without this level of this emotional surface hatred. That is, again, it's all the time that's the difference between depth not depth. In other words, we, relatively speaking, modernity assumed war only on the surface, and we turn to the thesis that it goes into depth. This is either love at a depth, or hatred can also be at a depth. There are stories when his actions are committed, with which hatred begins at the depth. Well, conditionally, there are archetypes that include this. And this again comes to the question of responsibility. Yes, that is, respectively, for the symbols that you raise on the banners, for the signs that you use. In other words, it all very much becomes a sharp increase in the level, I repeat, of the personal responsibility of each participant in his place of these processes, which, of course, is a complete contradiction with the environment in which people were brought up. Because, excuse me, we have a mainstream and paradigmatic vector that no one is responsible for anything. No one owes anyone for anything. Don't think, spread it. Remember, there was such a thesis. That is, as if this is all just a complete contradiction. And here it's just such a tragedy that. How is that? I would like us to. I would like this collective learning process to go differently. Of course, I would like to, but, unfortunately, it does not happen. I want to join and confirm that my experience of communicating with the military there, and even friendship with some of them, shows that they reflect this as a heavy duty. It's not difficult for the military, except for those who are very demoralized, and who were kicked out just by this routine of war. They do not like to call the enemy names. They love him once a person. Notice, yes, this is a very important point. They are not enthusiastic about planting there in our country, for some price tags, with some. For any. In other words, this is a general principle. This is the same thing as there are huge protests in America, namely veterans. Yes, it is also not a movement of veterans, who often oppose excessive mediatization and psychotization there. This is a general principle. Just because people are in direct contact, they understand what it is. Well, with the exception, as you correctly noted, conditionally there are 2% of psychopaths. There is a problem with the fact that there are psychopathic people. They commit acts that then turn out to be in plain sight, and are used for emotional sublimation. But if we look at the norm as a whole, then paradoxically in the war the front is an order of magnitude healthier than you. Why is this happening? And historically, we can say it has been more or less always, but now it is becoming, unfortunately, a deliberate threat, because the destruction of the rear is used as part of a military strategy. It is the psychological destruction of the rear. If in the Second World War you saw bombed, now you are bombing the rear with MEMS. This is also a very big problem. And it is very interesting for the next step, realizing that this is not relevant, but a long step, in how the ethical will be joined with the rational. After all, the authors of the theory of a just war, they managed to sell their theory to the military. It was useful to them. And like the current rational critics who say, why are you discussing something ethical here? We have direct rational considerations here. We don't know how you see the war, how to end it, how to start it, where to get resources. Why do we need this whole philosophy? But they don't know because they don't know who they are. That is, they are because the worldview for the most part, well, let's just say, well, all that. Well, depending on how much modernity has been plowed into the culture. Well, let's do it this way. Throughout Christian culture, he trampled right thoroughly. As a result, it turned out that all the politicians in the spiritual worldview turned out to be liberals. Well, liberals in the sense that they insist on the exclusive primacy of the individual and sincerely do not see the place, role, meaning of this collective part of identity. Therefore, it is clear that it is hard for them, it is bad for them. But I say, but this is the learning process. It can go faster with smaller ones, with a lower price for the community. It can take longer with a higher price for the community. Unfortunately, there is a little history of us here, as if it is at the same time optimistic in terms of the vector, yes, but let's just say, in the process, it is very heavy. In other words, in the end, I think the sequence of events will be something like this. The fact that when you have people in the elite who are aware of who they are, who do not separate themselves from who they control, they consider themselves conditionally just hired managers at work, and in their hearts, as you know, there is such a mem song, that I am with you in my heart, but I am here in Miami, yes. That's about it, that's it, yes. That's when this certain resonance happens, then there will be an opportunity to do what we are talking about. In other words, this is actually a very big problem, because it turns out that the whole problem of war is only a derivative of the problem of the modern state. The modern state is built according to its very, very deep theological, well, to say nature, on deception and hypocrisy in the interaction of those in power and those they govern. In other words, this turns out to be a fundamental problem for us. Again, I will always emphasize, a global problem. In other words, this is not a private problem, it is a global problem, and invented, well, expressed in words for the first time, by Thomas Hobbes. That is, like the 17th century, England, Holland. That is, where the model was created from. But now it has spread and become the norm. That is, well, I'll just emphasize it. The question of the global. It seems that what you said is very directly applicable to Russian and Ukrainian society. Yes. But it's just this hackneyed off. To the Israeli, where the war really is, where the elite is not, there is no inseparable from the people. Literally the sons of all the first persons at the front. Absolutely. What, however, does not protect Israel from actions that at first glance seem irrational in the long term. Yes, the problem is different. Well, let's do it like this. Let's talk about Israel first as part of the lecture, and then I'll just comment a little bit. Just note that what you described is possible in Israel, and it turned out to be possible because Israel is a permanently warring country. The paradox. This is a country that is constantly at war, in fact. That is, if anyone who has been to Israel immediately feels that it is not. This is a country that has a war. This is not an abstract concept, but this war is part of everyday life. And I will venture to make this casual statement. And that is why you see an elite that does not separate itself from the people. A paradox, right? In the pursuit of peace, this separation happens much faster. When you accept the necessity of war, this spike, on the contrary, increases. This is also an unpleasant discovery for, let's say, humanists of the 70s of the 20th century. And now, but, at the same time, understand, there are still, as it were, circumstances of force majeure. Sometimes, when history, well, when the situation doesn't help you at all. Unfortunately, modern Israel, after the Hamas attack, found itself in a situation where there are no good solutions at all. It makes sense. That's just how they don't exist at all. And this is actually the main problem that is long-standing for the world community from this whole story. It is not in Israel. It is that, probably for the first time in the last, well, a very long period of time, decades, maybe even a century. Probably, a decade is more likely there. Well, at least 50-60 years, terrorism has achieved its result. After all, the goal of terrorism is always a political goal. It is absolutely not important there are military results, how many people will die there, but terrorism is a political goal. The Hamas Act has achieved. I have already said this in another interview, but I repeat that if the goal of Hamas was, as it were, to return to a real discussion of the two-state dialogue, then this goal has been achieved. But, at least one of the goals, and this goal is political, and she has already achieved. Everyone is talking about it now. Any rational military analyst, since you speak rationally, will say that any creation of a Palestinian state in the current conditions is a strategic defeat for Israel. Maybe the last such throw-in for our conversation today. And if you look, go back again to the philosophical division, into this with pathos and logos, then how does the future thinking about war, which can lead to a new Utphalian world, combine not only ethos and rationality, but also this with pathos? How is that? Through culture, through art, of course, only. That is, not through the media, but through art, through the high. Emotions are also of a different order. There are emotions of this limbic system, and there are emotions of cranes flying. There are emotions of a ballad about a soldier. There are emotions, but I'm giving examples that are just probably close to listeners. There are emotions from Sevajima's letter. That is, as if it comes a little later, it seems to me. But this is the task of culture, and the duty of people of culture in conditions of war, like this, like Pushkin's. And for a long time, I will be kind to the people, that the feelings are good, that in my cruel age, I glorified freedom, that I called for mercy to the fallen. This is also a question of responsibility, and that is, this question is about culture, which should separately reflect on itself, because right now the mainstream culture is the same too, working with low-grade emotion, shocking it all at once. Well, mainstream. Again, I don't take everyone. This, well, according to the vector, it is like this. Namely, in conditions of war, it is the duty of culture to work with high emotions, just so that a person's heart does not get rough, especially in the rear, so that people remain people. And this is a duty, it's a job, it's a responsibility, sort of. Cancellation culture. Well, yes, of course. Culture instead of culture. Cancellation is a very good concise thesis. Well, like this. Well, or me, I can repeat, cranes are flying instead of a blue light. Or TikTok, that's even okay. The blue light is modern, and modern evil is TikTok. Here is the fact that the war fit into a TikTok. This is an example of just this evil. That is, it is impossible. That is, there are, well, some, I repeat, internal self-restrictions. That is, it's because in any case, dancing on the bone turns out. In other words, it is impossible to superimpose videos under a cheerful music, as there, I do not know. People explode into pieces. Sort of. This is if we talk about modern reality. Well, it didn't start with this war, by the way. This has already begun, I repeat, in fact indirectly, in the Gulf War. But the first Ijilovci used it completely innovatively. A terrorist movement organization banned in Russia. I do not know how to write a stamp there. For the first time, in fact, they came up with this acceleration. In other words, this is a separate topic. There's just no time now, but a lot of media technologies have actually been worked out by them. And now, they have just reached a new level, connecting with the philosophical base, but, unfortunately, of NATO institutions. Because now only two countries in the world are rationally approaching this. Well, one bloc, and one country, China and NATO. In other words, here they are engaged in cognitive warfare, seriously, on scientific grounds, with the connection of neurobiology, with the connection of everything that is needed, that is, how the emotion affects, somehow through a big date can be manipulated and so on and so forth. But against this, I repeat, there is an antidote. And in fact, this antidote was discussed throughout the conversation. It's actually very simple on the surface. This is awareness and self-control. In other words, as soon as you begin to monitor your emotions, feelings, breaks, you acquire immunity, which, well, puts a very powerful obstacle between you and attempts at this emotional sublimation. That's why I call the listeners to this.